Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive. We're going way back this time, 1967.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So this paper, um, Masked Depression in Children and Adolescents
Okay.
by a child psychiatrist, Dr. Kurt Glaser. And this is really fascinating stuff because I think we all know about adult depression,
Right.
but what about kids? Like, how does that actually manifest?
Well, and that's what's so cool about Dr. Glaser's work is he was already saying back then, like, hey, you can't just look at kids through an adult lens. It's different.
Totally. And he uses this phrase, masked depression.
Yeah.
Like it can look like all sorts of things, but not necessarily that classic sadness we think of.
And I think one of his most important points is that it's not just about like the behavior itself,
Right.
but the intensity of the feelings behind it.
Okay.
Like if a kid is expressing worthlessness or rejection, but it seems way out of proportion to what's actually happening in their life.
That's when we need to pay attention.
Exactly. Like you can't just dismiss it as, oh, they're just being dramatic or it's teenage angst. It's like, no, there's something deeper going on here.
That's a good point because I think as parents or even, teachers or anyone who works with kids,
Yeah,
we can sometimes be like, oh, that's just kids being kids.
totally. And to really understand this whole masking idea,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's helpful to look at how it shows up even in babies.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So Dr. Glaser talks about Spitz's work on this thing called analytic depression. Have you heard of that?
I don't think so.
So basically it means that babies who are separated from their mothers for long periods,
Oh, wow.
they go through these phases of protest and rejection and then eventually this kind of like apathy.
So even infants can experience something like depression.
Yeah, it's really kind of heartbreaking, but it shows how early these patterns can start.
That's intense.
And Spitz's work really highlighted how crucial that early bond is,
Yeah.
Disruptions can have a ripple effect throughout development. I always think of it like the foundation of a house.
Oh,
If it's shaky, everything built on top is going to be unstable.
that's a great analogy. I like that.
So yeah, this masking starts early,
Yeah.
but it gets even trickier as kids grow up.
Okay, so like what are some of the mind-blowing examples that we're going to see in these case studies?
Well, the delinquency cases are pretty striking.
Okay.
Dr. Glaser presents a bunch where teens are engaging in all this risky behavior,
Like what kind of behavior?
like running away, stealing cars even. And it turns out they're actually profoundly depressed.
Really? So it's not just like typical teenage rebellion.
Right, exactly. Wow.
It's like a cry for help.
There's that one case I remember reading about the 17-year-old shoemaker's apprentice
Uh-huh.
who like vanished for days and his family was freaking out.
Right.
And, on the surface, it seemed like, oh, he's just being a rebellious teenager. But it turned out to be much deeper than that.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so important about Dr. Glaser's message is instead of just focusing on punishing these kids,
Yeah.
it's like let's try to understand the pain that's driving these behaviors.
So delinquency can be a mask. What else? What are some other ways this depression shows up? Well, he also talks about school phobia.
Oh, yeah, school phobia. I've heard of that.
Yeah, and this one's interesting because he cites research showing a strong link between school refusal
Okay.
and depression in kids, but also a high incidence of depression in their parents.
Oh, wow.
So it's like this whole depressive constellation within families.
So it's not just that the kid is afraid of school itself, but there's like this whole dynamic happening at home.
Exactly. You can imagine how growing up in a house where depression is present, even if it's not talked about,
Right.
could really impact a child's development.
Oh, absolutely.
They might not even have the words to express it. So it comes out as this school avoidance.
So it's kind of a way of coping.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've got delinquency, we've got school phobia. What else is on this list of masked symptoms?
Well, learning problems also make the list.
Learning problems, how does that fit in?
So Dr. Glaser argues that some kids who are referred for academic struggles might actually have underlying depression.
Oh, wow, I never thought about it.
Okay. Yeah, he talks about cases where like trauma or loss or even just like unexpressed anxieties are at the root of the learning difficulties.
It's like the emotional stuff is getting in the way of them being able to learn.
Exactly. And it's not always obvious, like
Right.
that case with 8-year-old Roy.
Oh, yeah, Roy, what was going on with him?
So he had this overwhelming fear of death
Okay.
that was really interfering with his schoolwork. And it turned out his parents had some health issues. His sister had died.
Oh, gosh.
And it was just like all this stuff was going on.
Yeah.
And it was impacting his ability to focus on school.
So it's like his world was in turmoil and it was showing up in his grades.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that kids process grief and stress differently than adults.
Right.
Sometimes those unexpressed emotions can really sabotage learning.
And if we just focus on like, oh, you need to get your grades up,
Right.
we're missing this whole other piece.
Exactly. We're not addressing the root cause.
This is really making me rethink how I view kids who are labeled as like learning disabled.
Yeah.
It's not always just a cognitive.
Right. It's so much more complex than that.
Okay, so last one on this list of mask symptoms, psychosomatic reactions. What are those all about?
So this one can be really perplexing
Okay.
because Dr. Glaser talks about kids with colitis headaches, chronic stomach pain,
Wow.
all these physical symptoms, but doctors can't find any physical cause.
So it's like their bodies are expressing their emotional distress?
Exactly. It's like their bodies are screaming out for help, but we don't always understand the language.
That's a really powerful way to put it.
And that's exactly what Dr. Glaser was trying to do, back in 1967.
Yeah.
Shake things up, get people to see childhood problems in a new light.
It's like he was way ahead of his time.
Totally.
I mean, this is incredible. We've got delinquency, we've got school phobia, learning problems, physical symptoms,
Right.
and it all comes back to this idea that depression in kids, it doesn't look like the classic adult version.
It hides behind all these masks.
It's like a disguise.
Exactly. And before we move on, we have to mention one more group that Dr. Glaser specifically talks about:
Okay.
children with intellectual disabilities.
Right, because they might understand that they're different or they struggle in certain areas,
Yeah.
but they don't necessarily have the tools to express or cope with those feelings.
Right. And so it can make this whole mass depression thing even more complex.
So what does Dr. Glaser suggest we do differently in these cases?
Well, he advocates for a shift in approach, moving away from just focusing on traditional training methods,
Okay.
which can sometimes reinforce feelings of inadequacy,
Right. Yeah.
And instead he suggests finding activities where these kids can experience success
Okay.
and build self-worth.
I like that.
Give them a chance to shine.
It's like we're building them up instead of constantly pointing out what they can't do.
Exactly.
We're focusing on their strengths.
Yeah, and we'll dive deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive. But for now,
No, this is so much to take in.
yeah,
I'm just blown away by how ahead of his time Dr. Glaser was.
I know, it's amazing.
Imagine the impact his work has had on generations of kids.
It's incredible, isn't it? And what's even more amazing is how relevant his insights remain today.
That's true.
We'll unpack that more when we come back.
Okay, so stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. It's really cool how Dr. Glaser, he championed this individualized approach,
Yeah.
especially for kids with intellectual disabilities. He truly believed in focusing on their strengths, creating environments where they could thrive.
Totally. And it wasn't just talk, he actually put these ideas into practice,
Right?
especially in institutions which were a lot more common back then.
Yeah, he talks about how kids with mild to moderate intellectual disabilities could really flourish
Okay.
when they were given responsibilities that played to those strengths.
I remember reading about how they could be attendants for other residents
Right.
who had more severe disabilities. And it's like a light bulb went off for me.
Oh.
Instead of focusing on their limitations,
Yeah,
we give them opportunities to contribute,
exactly.
to shine, to feel valued.
And that sense of accomplishment can be so empowering.
Yeah, especially for a child who's, maybe internalized the sense of inadequacy.
Right. It's like planting a seed of self-belief.
And it can grow into something amazing.
Totally.
It's like we're rewiring their brains for confidence
Yeah.
by creating these positive feedback loops.
It's like they do well, they get praised, they feel good about themselves.
And then they want to do even better.
Exactly.
But Dr. Glaser also acknowledges that this kind of nurturing environment
Yeah.
is not always a given,
Sadly, no.
especially in institutions that are maybe understaffed or under-resourced.
Right. And he talks about how in those less than ideal situations, that positive cycle can actually reverse.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The child acts out, they get punished,
Ugh,
they feel even worse about themselves, and it just keeps spiraling.
that's so sad.
It is. But his point is that even in those tough situations, we have to be mindful of the impact our actions have on these kids.
Right, we can either reinforce their helplessness or empower them.
Exactly.
So the adults in their lives, the psychiatrists, caregivers, parents,
Mm-hmm.
they become these really pivotal figures.
Absolutely. And Dr. Glaser saw the psychiatrist's role as critical,
Well,
not just treating the individual child, but advocating for change.
Like what kind of change?
Like training staff, educating parents, pushing for policies that prioritize the emotional well-being of all residents.
Like a holistic approach.
Yeah, you can't separate a child's mental health from their social and environmental context.
Everything's connected.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, he shares a couple of case studies
Okay.
that really highlight the complexities of masked depression in kids with intellectual disabilities.
Those cases were so fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the 22-year-old woman
Oh, yeah.
who had spent years in an institution basically abandoned by her family.
Right.
And on the surface, she was constantly pushing boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
promiscuity, fighting, running away.
It seemed like classic attention seeking.
Right. But Dr. Glaser, he saw beyond that.
He did. He saw this deep sadness and hopelessness that she was masking.
With this facade of indifference.
Yeah, it's like she built up these walls to protect herself.
From more hurt.
Exactly.
And her acting out wasn't malicious.
No, it was a way to connect.
To be seen,
Yeah.
even if it was in a negative way.
And it really underscores that behavior is communication.
Especially for those who can't express themselves verbally.
Right. If we only focus on the behavior,
We miss the whole story.
we miss the pain and the unmet needs behind it.
And we end up punishing the child for their distress.
Instead of addressing the root cause.
And this applies to all kids, not just those with intellectual disabilities.
Absolutely.
What about that 13-year-old girl who is struggling with feelings of inadequacy
Oh, yeah.
and social isolation?
She was constantly comparing herself to others, feeling like she didn't measure up.
And it started manifesting physically.
Like kiddick's compulsive behaviors.
And her poor mother, she was at her wit's end.
I can only imagine feeling so overwhelmed.
Not knowing how to help?
It's heartbreaking, and it's a situation that so many families face.
Yeah.
Parents who desperately want to support their kids, but they just don't know how.
And that's where early intervention and access to mental health resources are so crucial.
Absolutely. If we can help parents understand what's going on beneath the surface, they can become better advocates for their children.
And Dr. Glaser emphasizes that this work isn't just about the individual child.
It's about fostering a culture of understanding and support.
Within families, schools, communities.
Exactly. Creating spaces where vulnerability is met with compassion, not judgment.
Recognizing that mental health is just as important as physical health.
Especially in those formative years.
When kids are developing their sense of self.
And he even suggests that recognizing masked depression could have fundamentally changed how society approaches childhood problem behaviors.
Wow, that's a big statement.
It is. It's like he's challenging us.
To look beyond the labels. To see these kids as whole human beings.
Struggling to navigate a complex world.
What if, instead of viewing them as delinquent or difficult,
we saw their behavior as a sign that they're hurting?
That they need support.
How would that change our approach?
That's a question for all of us.
Parents, educators, policymakers.
We've come a long way since Dr. Glaser's time.
We have.
But his work reminds us that there's still so much work to do.
To create a world where all children feel seen, heard, and supported.
It's a beautiful vision.
Yeah.
It's like we think we know what's going on with these kids, but Dr. Glaser's saying, hey, take a step back.
Yeah, look deeper.
Because we might be misinterpreting their behavior completely.
Like, it's so easy to just slap a label on a kid.
Right.
Oh, they're spoiled, they're manipulative.
They're just trying to get attention.
Exactly. But what Dr. Glaser's showing us is that
there's more to the story.
There's a whole world of hurt and unmet needs underneath all that.
And it really makes you think about, how we approach those tough behaviors.
Yeah, instead of coming in with judgment.
Yeah.
Come in with curiosity.
What happened to this child?
Right. What are they trying to communicate?
Because their behavior is a form of communication.
Absolutely. And when we shift our perspective like that, it changes everything.
Instead of punishment,
right,
we can offer support and understanding.
And that's what these kids need, to heal and to thrive.
To feel safe to express their emotions.
Yeah. Whether it's at home, at school, in the community.
We need to create spaces where vulnerability is okay.
Where kids feel heard and understood.
And where they can learn to cope with those big feelings.
Because growing up is tough.
It is. And for kids with intellectual disabilities, it's even more complex.
And I love how Dr. Glaser emphasizes finding activities that play to their strengths.
Yeah. Give them a chance to experience success.
Build that self-worth.
Because every child has something special to offer.
Absolutely, no matter their abilities.
We need to celebrate that.
And create opportunities for them to shine.
It's not about comparing them to others.
Right.
It's about helping them reach their own unique potential.
It's about that sense of purpose and belonging.
Dr. Glaser's work has really left a mark.
It has on generations of kids and professionals.
But it also makes us think about, okay, what now?
Yeah.
What can we do differently today?
How can we apply his insights in a modern context?
Are we still making those same mistakes
Labeling kids?
without really understanding what's going on
Are we meeting their mental health needs?
in our schools, in our communities?
Are we creating those safe spaces where they can talk about their struggles?
Where their emotions are
Where
validated?
they learn healthy coping skills?
These are big questions
They are.
for all of us, not just the experts.
As parents, as educators, as members of society,
We have a responsibility to these kids,
to keep learning,
to keep
to
advocating.
create a world where they can truly flourish.
This deep dive has been amazing,
It has.
eye-opening, thought-provoking.
Dr. Glaser's work is a gift.
It is, and I hope it's inspired you all to think a little differently about the kids in your lives,
To look deeper, to listen more closely.
to offer that support and understanding that every child deserves.
Because every child matters.
Thank you for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
And remember, keep those conversations going. Keep exploring. Keep learning.
Because the journey never ends.
Until next time, stay curious and keep those amazing brains buzzing.